Well, welcome everybody to the second half of our program. I want to thank you all for joining this very important conversation about U.S. China relations during a period where it seems we've got a spiraling threat escalation going on, exacerbated, as some of our participants started talking about this morning, by domestic developments, both here in the United States and in China as we speak. We have many issues with China to deal with these days, challenges such as its assertiveness on the global stage, mercantilist trade policies, insufficiently open investment regime, and then this relatively new issue that the first panel addressed about a perception of China's growing influence or attempts to influence the discourse in the United States and to export some of the repressive tactics that they use at home overseas as well. The first panel was devoted to trying to identify what some of these challenges are, and our second panel is going to be trying to come up with some discussion of what the responses ought to be, or what Frank Wu described as sort of engagement 2.0. We're very delighted to have three wonderful experts on our second panel as well. You have their bios in the materials, so I won't spend time describing them again. But again, we're going to be here to try to address how should China effectively respond to the challenges as well as the opportunities that are available in the U.S.-China relationship. We are going to start off with Doug Paul, who's Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, followed by Elizabeth Knupp, who is the Ford Foundation's Director for China and normally based in Beijing, so we're thrilled to have her here. And last but not least, we've got Oriana Schuyler Mastro, who's an assistant professor at Georgetown's Foreign Service School and also a Jean Kirkpatrick Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. So again, as with the first panel, we're going to ask each of them to speak for somewhere around 7 minutes. Then we'll have a short discussion among ourselves and then turn the discussion open to the floor once again. So Doug, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Is it hearing all right? A few people in this room were probably here for one of the memorable moments on the Brookings stage when a wonderful, now retired scholar named Jonathan Spence came to speak and offer wisdom on watching U.S. China relations and China over the centuries of history that he studied. And I think in context of the debate that provoked this meeting today, it's useful to look back at one of his early books called To Change China. And that book was a chronicle of the various missionaries and advocates and generals and merchants who had gone to China in their own way, each hoping to bring change to Christianity, to bring capitalism, to mold China to a different model. And the story really was, you're going to fail. And you have to be modest in your expectations of what you can take to China from overseas. Fast forward, we're now in the middle of the two meetings in Beijing, and the National People's Congress is in the process of obediently producing a change in the Constitution to permit the current leader or successors more than 2 terms in office as a state chairman or president of China. And I think this really encapsulates in contemporary terms what was at the core of Jonathan Spence's book, which is China is self-referential. China suffers from the inability to develop a legitimacy for the regime. And therefore, there's a constant struggle within the regime to be on top of the system and assert my groups or my ethnic groups' legitimacy over the others and to be able to call the shots in China. And this is very frustrating to us. We don't, and I think it's pretty frustrating to the Chinese who for more than 2,000 years haven't seen a lot of progress in dealing with the question of succession mechanisms in China, even though they've seen fantastic material progress in the day-to-day livelihoods or access to education, and most recently in international travel, with really big changes. Now, starting with that observation, I'm pretty much sure I'm the oldest person on the panels, and the virtue of that is the virtues of being the oldest person on the panel are few. But one of them is sort of perspective. And I want to introduce some perspective today, too, because of the current debate about what China's doing, not only within China, but on the spreading footprint it has globally. And that's to recall China's forerunners. When the United States reached the end of its industrialization program, which culminated at the end of World War II, we had predominant manufacturing skills, financial overweight, and tremendously, suddenly underused capacity that had been built up in the Depression and the war. And that immediately became an outreach by the United States. So we had Americans turning up with capital and ideas and construction in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa to various extents. And our capacity to take productivity and new ideas to the world, Latin America should be included too, was greatly exceeded the human talent we had to manage it. We didn't know what we were doing. And long story short, the novel, The Ugly American, is kind of the essence of how we got ourselves into the Southeast Asia War and Indochina War, and didn't really know what we were doing when we went in, and certainly didn't know much when we left. But we spent vast blood and treasure in a feckless pursuit in Southeast Asia. That was our experience, and we've gotten better at it. We've got people trained in USAIA and U.S. Various agencies who can go comfortably into Central Africa or Latin America and have an idea what might work and what might not work and what might be good for American interest there. We were succeeded in this by the Japanese in the 1970s and 80s, when Japan reached the end of its industrialization program. It had excess capacity, a lot of state guidance. The Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry, then known as MITI, was seen as a hidden hand for a lot of these activities by Japanese, especially in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere as well, and very sensitively in the United States, which was seen to be being preyed upon by Japanese conglomerates and by the Japanese state in marketing automobiles and steel, just to pick a couple items that might be in the news recently. And we watched as the Japanese came to the U.S. in the 1970s and 80s, and they really didn't have the talent in their ranks to do the international business or the government business. They had to develop that talent. They had to train people. And in the early days, the easy way to deal with that in an American context was to go out and hire lobbying firms and various kinds of consultants. And a whole conspiracy theory emerged. By the end of the 1980s, we had reached a point where Japan was behind every Bush, somehow manipulating our economy, and we were going to be taken over by the Japanese. And even though their system was not inherently inimical to ours, we weren't going to adopt an imperial system or try to have a continuing shuttle of non-entity prime ministers. So it wasn't really much of a threat to our system. Now, the Koreans had an episode in the 90s, and now it's China's turn. And China's bigger, louder, and probably messier than any of its predecessors at reaching the end of its industrialization process, disposing of vast capacity, financial and industrial, and is ready to deploy it overseas. Now, I only have limited time here. We should be much more self-confident as we watch all of this. There are things that we can share. You know, China has created, in the previous administration, and objected to the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This was undermining the established international financial institutions that had been set up under the Bretton Woods system. But lo and behold, the AIIB has turned out to be an improvement on the ADB and the World Bank's internal procedures, because they had lived through it and brought their own experience to improving that. So I think we've got to, as David Shambaugh said earlier, study ruthlessly and empirically what is going on in these situations and not draw great extensive inferences about what this means for ourselves. China has talked in the most recent party Congress, the leader talked about a fang'an for distributing ideas for development to other countries. And many people have taken this to be an effort to export the Chinese system. Like, pay attention to the words. They said we're going to export it with Chinese characteristics. Who in Nepal, India, Vietnam, Japan, Middle Africa wants to take on Chinese characteristics? It's inherently not transferable. And I think that this is something that we ought to bear in mind as we go forward, looking at one issue after another as they arise. Thank you.
Elizabeth?
Great. So, Jamie and Chung, thank you so much for having me. As Jamie said, I spend most of my time living in China. And so the last 2 days in Washington, I feel like I've like a sister from another planet, right? Coming here and listening to kind of the level of discussion about U.S. China relations, the content of that discussion. So it's been very helpful for me, and I've learned a lot. And I just want to make a few observations, maybe from a different perspective of one sitting inside China. And also the Ford Foundation is prominent American NGO operating in China, and there may be some questions that we want to discuss around that. But I just wanted to make a few observations around this question of engagement. So I think, first of all, and I think we all agree, engagement isn't an end in itself. It's actually a tool to achieve other kinds of ends that we may have as a country, right? So when Nixon visited China in the 1970s, he wasn't going simply, to have a period of engagement. There was a strategy of which engagement with China was part, and that strategy had to do with balancing the Soviet Union and probably many other dimensions of U.S. foreign policy. So engagement was a tool in that process. I think this question about whether we should or shouldn't have let China into the WTO, we have to put it in the context of the time. At that time, engaging China in the WTO was part of a tool in a bigger strategy, which really was helping get Americans to have access to the market in China, right? So I think we have to think about engagement not as a good or bad end in itself, but as a tool that we have in our toolbox among many tools. So I think that's something that we sort of need to keep in our mind. And I think one part of engagement has been over the last 30 to 40 years of helping to introduce ideas around social and economic and political development to a country that had previously been closed. And this is where the Ford Foundation has played a pretty significant role, not necessarily simply to change China with that objective, but rather to introduce new ideas. And I would say at the time, over time, China actually was looking for new ideas. And I think there's a very excellent book called Unlikely Partners by Julian Gewirtz, which I would highly recommend reading, because it puts into context that China was also looking for new ideas. And they weren't just looking at the United States. They were looking at Eastern Europe, and they were looking at lots of places to get ideas to help them with their domestic sort of development, social and economic development, and maybe even political development, depending on sort of the time. So I think engagement is a tool for many different kinds of objectives, and I think it can still be a useful tool in the kinds of objectives that we might have with China today. I would also, my second comment is that I don't think we can say that engagement failed. I think what we have to look at is that China has changed, right? So possibly as a successful outcome of engagement, China is really much different than it was 30 or 40 years ago. I think everyone understands that and knows that. But I think on a policy level, the United States needs to get more clear and more rational about the fact that China is a different country than it was 30 or 40 years ago. It is stronger economically. It has an aspiration in the world that it didn't have 30 or 40 years ago, and that aspiration in the world is going to bring it into a competition with the United States, which also has its aspirations in the world, and that how we manage that competition is a really important thing that we need to think about right now, and we need to be having our own sort of long-term strategic way of thinking about how we want to engage with China at this moment of competition. And it is a competition, and many people on the first panel talked about this very eloquently. It is a bit of a competition around cultural norms. It is a competition around how you view the world, and that, I think we just have to recognize that's a reality, and that China is a country that we're not going to be able to disengage from, and we're not going to be able to ignore. And they also have take a longer term view of kind of this, of their ambitions in the world, and it would behoove us, I think, to start to put together some kind of a comprehensive strategic way of thinking about how we want to engage with China. The final thing couple things I just wanted to say is to think about sort of one of the questions that was posed to this panel was what might be some ways and places where an engagement tool might be useful. And we've talked about the AIIB and the Belt and Road, and Chinese interlocutors say to me in China often, the first 30 years of our development was about yingjing, about bringing in ideas, money, management skills, technical assistance that we needed to develop ourselves domestically. And the next 30 years is going to be about going out. So, and this is very important for the Ford Foundation, who celebrate our 30th anniversary in China this year, is that we were part of helping to bring in these ideas that the Chinese wanted to bring in. Now, China is interested in taking its own experience out, and it believes that it has had a pretty successful development experience story. And there is a push and pull. So China does want to push its development model out, but there are many countries that are pulling, that want it, that look at China's development and say, wow, I would really like to have that happen in my country, and how can I do it? So I think one of Doug's points is a really important one, which is what about the China experience is exportable, and what about it is truly a Chinese characteristic, and it's not going to be exportable. And I think we have a moment to kind of think about that. And my final point is to simply think about there is an opportunity for the U.S. to work together with China to kind of think about the global norms and standards for how we look at global governance in a way that allows us to influence those towards the norms and standards that we hold dear and that are essential to sort of our democratic governance processes. And it's not going to be the case necessarily that the U.S. is going to 100% prevail, but I also feel that China, particularly in the Belt and Road and AIIB and all these efforts, my sense is that they're not 100% confident yet about how to be a dominant global actor, that they're willing to be engaged with around thinking about what might be some global norms and standards if they are respected as a peer in the process of developing those global norms and standards. So when I say engagement hasn't failed but China has changed, we have to think about not think about China as a little brother that we are helping to develop, but rather as a peer on the world stage, that together we really want to think about what is the best kind of global development model, and how do you think about protecting rights and promoting equity and environmental sustainability when you are working in development in Africa or Latin America or along the Belt and Road. And I think there is a real opportunity there. And it can't just fall to organizations like the Ford Foundation to do this on our own. We are able to be more successful when it's embedded in a broader sort of American policy or framework or an ability to articulate our vision of what global development might look like. And then I think there is a real opportunity for us to kind of co-create a new set of global governance standards that everyone that sort of frames the area of competition where we will be competing, because I don't think we can say or think that we're not in some kind of a competition with China. I'll stop there.
Great. All right, Oriana?
Thank you, Jamie and Chung, for having me. It's good to be here, and just to clarify before I issue my remarks that these are my own personal views and don't represent those of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or the United States Air Force. I was asked to kind of provide some ideas about ways to move forward in the U.S.-China relationship, and I fear that while I'm going to try to do that towards the end, I fear you're going to be somewhat disappointed. Because before I do that, I want to talk about what I call the two great confusions. Two big things that I am confused about that makes it difficult for me to come up with viable options for the United States to maintain its influence at acceptable cost within the region. The first big confusion I'll talk about is what behaviors are threatening. The second big confusion is what are U.S. strategic objectives vis-a-vis China. And I know these are two things that we talk about at great length, and a lot of times we also use terms that come from international relations theory, which obviously as a professor I think is very useful. But I think academics have kind of failed, or perhaps have a lot more work to do to provide policymakers with useful frameworks about how to think about these issues. So the first one about what types of behaviors are threatening. I've heard a lot of panelists talk about China expanding its influence in the political, economic, and military space. My understanding of the initial U.S. policy of engagement was that it was designed to integrate China into the world order such that China would pursue its interests in a peaceful way. If the goal was to deter Chinese blatant use of force, we have succeeded. We haven't had a war with China, and it doesn't look like anytime soon we're going to have a major conflict with China. I think if we're honest with ourselves, there was this implicit assumption in that. Not only that by integrating China into the world order, they would not directly use force to obtain their goals, but through that process, China would come to learn that they were better off with the United States in charge. And while in this town now, you've probably read the Ratner-Campbell piece in Foreign Affairs, we all generally agree that it was naive to believe that that type of interaction with China was going to lead to liberalization of that society. There are still people that have this kind of implicit assumption that surely China benefits from the world order, and surely they don't want Japan to remilitarize, and so just with a little bit more interaction, they'll come to learn that it's better off with someone else in charge. A big problem of this also has to do with this concept of the U.S.-led world order. There's these ideas of, what China is doing within this order, but this order is actually not comprehensive. A lot of what I see China doing is not directly confronting this order, but instead building other types of relationships or orders in the gaps where that U.S. leadership didn't exist. Would we say that China was supplanting the United States in Central Asia? I wouldn't say completely against my will, but I spent a month with my husband driving around Tajikistan for his birthday along the Afghanistan border, all through Uzbekistan. I didn't see that, the Chinese were there because the United States was missing. Same thing when I was in Africa this year. So it seems that instead of trying to directly challenge the United States, what China did is they wanted to increase their influence, political and economic, and they looked to areas where the United States interests weren't so strong. And then they decided to build power in those areas. And so I'm not sure how much we can say that China is what you hear a lot, revisionist. Now, the term revisionist is also very confusing. I think it primarily was used to describe when a country relies primarily on military power to achieve its goals. But now we use it not about process, but about outcomes. If there's anything that China does that leads to an increase in Chinese influence and a potential reduction of U.S. influence, we consider that revisionist. And I don't know how useful that is. Was the United States the revisionist power when it called for the end of colonialism? Is Great Britain a revisionist because it's currently changing the European Union with its exit? So is it about process or is it about outcome? And I think part of the issue with China is if we want to be fair, the view was if China accumulated and exercised power through institutional means, then the United States would be okay with that. And when we talk about OBOR potentially being a threat, AIIB being a threat, the 6 economic corridors, China's economic power, and how they are leveraging those for their own influence, we see those as threatening, because the bottom line is it's partially about how China does it, but it's also about the outcomes. And what many in the United States see is a reduction of U.S. influence as a result, and that is problematic. So I don't really like to use the word revisionist as what types of behaviors are threatening. I like to say instead that rising powers, all countries, are trying to accumulate and exercise power. And China's relying for now on political and economic power. I think that's done on purpose to delay U.S. responses. I often say that if China, instead of building OBOR, had decided to try to build their own NATO, you better believe the United States response would have been a lot clearer. I hear often about OBOR, for example, well, once China builds bases along OBOR, military bases, then we'll know what their intentions are. Which brings me to my next point. China is not the United States. And we try to assess Chinese intentions and their power based on what the United States would do. Right? If they built these military bases along OBOR, then they have a goal of becoming a global power. If they don't, then we're less sure. But China, like many countries, rising countries before it, pursues power in a different way than the current great power. The United States, again, as an example, didn't pursue colonies. Didn't mean the United States wasn't interested in being a great power. And I fundamentally believe that China does not want a global military presence in the way that the United States has it. Not only because they don't currently have the capabilities, though I've written extensively about Chinese expeditionary capabilities and how they're improving, but because a rising power always looks to the great power and they ask themselves, what is the primary source of this country's decline? Right? We like to believe that the United States and Great Britain had a lot of, it was more about values, right? The United States didn't seek colonies because of values. But another reason was the United States looked to Great Britain and said, this whole empire thing seems to be very costly. It seems to be dragging Great Britain down. And so the United States didn't want to emulate that. And I think China is looking to a lot of U.S. behavior and thinking the same thing, that they don't want to emulate that either. So historical analogies, I don't think are very useful. People forget, we use Great Britain and China a lot, and people forget that the end of that story is that the United States overtook Great Britain. Even if it's done peacefully, I think the majority of Americans don't want the end of this story to be that China overtakes the United States. Also, even though this is also hopefully a bit out of the discussion, I have read recently discussions about, maybe containment, not engaging so much is the way to go. But people also forget that the United States conceded a sphere of influence to the Soviet Union. Right? Can you imagine how that containment strategy would have gone if the U.S. response to the Soviet Union was like it is with China, basically saying, no, you can't have a Soviet Union, you can only have Russia. And so I think we are in a very unique period in which we have a country that is rising, that's relying for now primarily on economic and political power to do so, which we've never had, in a region that is simultaneously rising, which we've never had, and in an international global order that is so institutionalized, which we've also never had. The United States is constrained by institutions and norms. No one's talking about launching a preventive war against China anytime soon. But guess what? That was the primary option historically for a great power. And by having those institutions, we've provided China with a means of accumulating power that does not seem so threatening. So what is the United States to do? Obviously, containment's not the answer. I don't think even deterrence is what the United States wants. I think what the United States wants is to deter and prevent China from using any form of coercion, whether it be economic, political, or military, to achieve its goals and to gain an advantage at the expense of the United States. This is very difficult in terms of a goal, and it's even more difficult given the current domestic dynamics in the United States. If you want to ensure that China can't accumulate power at the expense of the United States, this requires a willingness to escalate tensions and risk greater conflict to counter Chinese coercion, even when China is operating in what we call the gray zone, or they're using alternative methods like economic tools. And they also require that the United States bring more to the table in terms of security and economic benefits. The United States wants countries, especially in the region and in the world, to value primarily the security and economic relationship with the United States over China. But right now, the security, in many cases, can't balance what China is bringing economically. So we have to bring more to the table. And it seems in the economic front, this administration has very little interest in that. So that's problematic. The United States could build more coalitions instead of doing things bilaterally, maybe have a coalition in the South China Sea, trying to patrol those waters in a group environment. But great power competition in the end means every country is important. And just having our allies support us is not enough. It might also require the United States to get closer to a lot of countries that have unsavory domestic practices while simultaneously trying to maintain our norms and values, which is difficult. So I think the bottom line is, until in this country we have an honest debate about what type of behaviors China can engage in that, even though they lead to a reduction of influence, the United States is not going to try to counter, and what types of objectives in this very unique environment are reasonable and that we could achieve at an acceptable cost, it's very difficult to try to figure out what should be the nature of cooperation, what should be the nature of engagement, and what U.S. policy in the broader region should be. So I'll conclude there.
Thank you very much. So these were all very thoughtful comments that sort of brought a new perspective to the consideration of the U.S.-China relationship and what these concerns are that have been emerging recently, where it really seems like it's almost, as Bruce Jones put it, a paranoia about what China's up to, which may, as has also been said, more reflect our own insecurity and uncertainty these days as it would the realities. I'd like to push you all a little bit more, too, because this is all about responses. And a lot of the responses are on a very general plane. We heard a lot this morning, particularly about how the U.S. has to get its own house in order, and we need to be spending more money on education, et cetera, which seems like this is going to be very hard to do, and where are we going to get the money, given we've got these looming debt, growing now, and an administration that seems more interested in cutting rather than spending in those areas. In addition to changing attitudes toward China. But I'd like to start maybe in the order in which you spoke with you first, Doug, thinking a little bit more along the lines of what David did this morning, thinking about some specific things that we could be sitting down and talking to China about, ways that we would like to see them change their behavior, or ways that we ought to be adjusting ours to address specific concerns in the relationship.
Well, it's a very broad spectrum of possibilities. AIIB and Belt and Road Initiative are two which I think the U.S. should have worked hard to find a way to embrace. We're not road builders anymore. And if you've been on Amtrak, you know that for sure. And our airports are looking pretty shabby compared to the 60s. But we still are supreme in finance, creative finance, things like that. Bringing our financial capacity to what has been a big challenge for the Chinese and their partners in each of the BRI initiatives, such as they are at this point. The U.S., I think, can bring a lot of high-tech services and high-tech financial services to this kind of, and we'd be playing from a position of strength on fundamental matters that count and could bring stability to some places where we've not made a good investment in the past, such as Central Asia, where we have an abiding concern of unemployed Muslim youth and other problems that could fester up and bite us again, as it happened from Afghanistan. In managing regional crises, I think we've been overestimating China's ability to change the equilibrium and underestimating our ability to maintain a balance in the region, a room for maneuver for the various states who want to more gather around an American umbrella of international order, which tends to be less costly in military terms for small countries. Singapore is the great example. They depend on the world being calm and legal and orderly. And other countries all share this to some degree. And they would much rather have that than to have open competition with China. But China is just not going to be appealing to these countries as a source of protection, legal inspiration. And so the added measure of American involvement, whether it's material, physical, military, conceptual, really is not a big sweat for us. We should be able to do this pretty effectively because the makings are there at each of these East Asian states where the action is going to be more intense than farther afield. And farther afield, well, there's a lot more to be said as well. China right now is doing a lot in Africa. And I was recently with a study group that we went to the UAE and saw the platform. China's taking these massive container ships and offloading them in the UAE and then loading them onto smaller ships which are going to the smaller African ports. And they're doing a tremendous amount of really interesting stuff that's very welcome for jobs. Ethiopia is a great example. Strangely enough, Ethiopia's got this tremendously modernized economy compared to where it was a decade ago with a lot of Chinese help. And yet the Chinese have not made themselves particularly popular there. And again, going back to my lessons earlier, one of the things we learned is the more foreign aid we gave people, the less grateful they were. And that just comes with the territory. And we ought to be able to not only recognize it, but to exploit it.
So Elizabeth, one thing that Doug talked about, that U.S. companies getting more involved in AIB and projects, et cetera, and it reminds me of your idea too of trying to work together with China on some of these, their global initiatives. And isn't that an opportunity? One of the big concerns we've had about BRI and AIB was that China would launch a race to the bottom and not care about environment and governance norms, et cetera, when in fact we've seen the opposite. And doesn't getting involved with China overseas in these areas too give us an opportunity to work on some of those issues about which we've been concerned?
So yes, and so building on both your question and the recent comment. So I think sort of some of the work that the Ford Foundation is looking at as China goes abroad as an investor, as a foreign aid deliverer, et cetera, how is that understood and how does that happen on the ground in the countries outside of China? And this has to do with corporate social responsibility, it has to do with labor norms, it has to do with sustainability, environmental issues. And so is there a way that the United States can engage with China in those other countries to help to raise the standard around investment and around the delivery of foreign aid in a way that's beneficial for the communities where that aid is going? And then is there an opportunity for, if that changes behavior of Chinese entities on the ground in other countries, does that behavior then come back in to China and change behavior of companies, et cetera, inside China along these same lines of labor standards, sustainability issues? How do you sort of think about workers? How do you think about the environment, et cetera? This is kind of a theory of change that we have posited and are interested in seeing if this is something that is a viable way of engagement with China. The jury's out. We haven't done very much of it. But I think you can see that lots of Chinese companies in particular, and the Chinese government has learned quickly that by not engaging communities on the ground, they can have a great deal of failure in what they're trying to achieve. And so is there a way that we can take our experience and share that and learn together about better ways of engaging in development? And I'll just say one or two more things. So another interesting approach is to look at where the United States and China together can work in a third country. And we've funded a little bit of work on this on the African continent, where there are areas of instability on the African continent, strategic security risks there, where both the United States and China have interests in preserving the peace and stability. They may have their interests come from different places, but they're both interested in the same outcome. And so is there a way to work together and collaboratively to achieve better stability and peace and security in this instance in various regions on the African continent? But there are the Middle East might be another place to try to think about, do we have strategic interests that are shared that would give us a framework for collaboration and working together to try to identify solutions? I mean, I'm putting these out as sort of pie in the sky possibilities, but I do think that there might be some opportunities there.
Great. Okay. Oriana.
Well, that's a good segue because I focus mainly on military and security issues. And so I have a slightly maybe more pessimistic view about some of these areas that we can cooperate in. The first is, let me just say about cooperation, I think there has been this general idea, maybe not so much now, that we could cooperate with China on these less contentious issues, right? We could engage in exercises on humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and this type of cooperation would build goodwill and then help us in the military and security sphere resolve some of the more contentious issues, or at least manage those issues like South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan. In my view, that's not really how negotiations with China works. You know, that you build goodwill now and it'll pay off later. And so I think in general, our rule of cooperation has to be, does it contribute to U.S. objectives on this issue now? And if the answer is yes, then including China is a good idea. If the answer is no, then including China is not such a good idea. And I would just add to a bit of my skepticism about these calls. I often say the United States calls for China to be often more involved in security issues around the world, in the Middle East and Africa. But the day that China does become more involved, I think, is the day we'll regret that we asked them to be there, for a number of reasons. The first is that having the same interest is not enough. China and the United States might have different priorities and also different preferences about the tactics that they would like to employ to actually achieve their goals that can lead to a lot of problems. The second is, even though China has, and I could go on and on about all the advancements the Chinese military have made in the past 20 years and how they do present a real credible threat to the U.S. military in the Pacific, they are still have a lot of issues with capability and professionalism within their force. The last I heard, and this was just with an exchange with a Chinese officer, you know, they don't have a solid legal framework within their military of how to deal with military officers who, you know, not just violate orders, but if you're stationed somewhere and you engage in, you know, activities you shouldn't be engaging in, that you're punished, that you're tried, this type of thing. You have a country that, you know, hasn't fought a war in a long time, but also doesn't have a lot of this overseas experience. The military is professionalizing, but a lot of times, in my experience with mills with the Chinese, the senior officers don't even have, you know, 6th grade education, and the majority of them, their time in the United States was the first time they'd ever left the country, besides, you know, a handful that had also done some training in Russia or elsewhere. And so the United States doesn't always get it right. You know, the United States has a lot of issues when it engages in stabilization and other types of operations around the world. But in some cases, I think adding the Chinese into that mix might make it even harder for the United States to achieve its goals. And along those lines, I would just say on the sort of idea, since we brought up Ethiopia, I am a bit more optimistic about the United States' ability to compete, kind of the hearts and minds competition on the global stage. We know Secretary Tillerson is on his way to, I think, Ethiopia and Djibouti. I was in Djibouti in December. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was, again, this type of resentment that the Chinese hadn't learned that, you know, they hire 0 Djiboutians onto their base and they contribute nothing into the economy, while the United States base hires a lot of locals, and they also input, I think, $160 million every year. And so we hear a lot of frustrations in the United States, like, you know, China doesn't care who they do business with. They don't care how they do it. You know, maybe the United States needs to be more competitive. Another one is about the strategic narrative. China's so good at having one message, and we're not so good in the United States. But I don't think we should try to be more like China. I think the strength in the United States system is the norms and values that maybe the United States doesn't always live up to, but tries. And this provides a vision of why the United States as a leader is better than China as a leader. One of the main differences I see is that China prefers weaker partners, and the United States prefers its partners to be strong. And so I think we need to do a better job, not so much of countering directly what China is doing, but thinking more about what are the principles that led to this U.S.-led world order, and are we upholding them? In the South China Sea, are we just protecting our friends and allies, or are we really protecting freedom of navigation? And sometimes those two things are not the same thing. And so as long as we think more about what we think U.S. leadership actually should look like and try to adhere to those standards as much as possible, I think we have a better shot.
Great. Well, I have to say, one area I wish we could emulate China was Amtrak. And since Doug raised it, I just wanted to note that one reason why one of our panelists, Steve Orleans, is not here today is because of the snow up in the Northeast and the canceled trains and planes, and he couldn't make it down here. So anyway, it's time to open it up to the floor. I'm sorry, we only have 15 minutes left, so I'll do what my colleague had done earlier. We'll do about 3 questions at a time. So we'll start the lady back there with the hand up. With the glasses, yeah.
Thank you. This is a really great panel. My name is Xuan Lin from CGTN. I just have a question about potential military cooperation. I know at the beginning, Congressman Larson said we should have more cooperation with China on PLA exercise. But I think Professor Mastro made a very interesting point that including China on military training should be good for the U.S. at the moment. And I'm just curious, what are the criteria to understand what is good at the moment instead of just thinking about the future? Thank you.
Okay, second question. So you back there in the middle, the young man, the man sitting with the, yeah.
Thank you. Jonathan Wolfish with Legislative Strategies. Two-part question. Should this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy that's being brought back up by U.S. military, U.S. politicians be viewed as a response to Chinese actions in the Asia-Pacific region? And can it be successful if it doesn't have the economic components that being a part of the TPP would have brought?
Two-part. And then we'll get the young woman right behind her there with the hand up right by you there.
Liu Kun with China Radio International, and this question goes to President Paul, please. The Chinese government recently released a series of policies on Taiwan, which is basically, I think, just to give the equal treatment to investments and also tourism education from Taiwan. So compared with your time in Taiwan, how is the China policy towards Taiwan different these days, and how do you see the future of that? Is the China-Taiwan issue still relevant in China-U.S. relations today?
Great, thank you. Okay. So do you want to start off?
Sure. On the question of military cooperation, I should have also specified that there's one contingency that I think would be useful for China to be involved in militarily, and that is a North Korea contingency. So I've written about this extensively in the January-February issue of Foreign Affairs, that I think actually Chinese military presence in that one case would be beneficial for the United States. But broader military exercises, it's all about what the purpose is. If you think that that type of interaction is going to lead to more beneficial views between the two sides, I mean, I worked as a translator for one of these and sat next to a Chinese officer in which over hors d'oeuvres he turned to me and said, "You know, we're all willing to die for our country, right?" I was like, well, you might have to if you keep on acting like this. But the point is that if you're trying to build goodwill, I don't think it does a great job. But if you want to do it primarily for deterrence purposes, and this is from a U.S. perspective, show China, maybe that the United States military is stronger than it thinks, and also to get information about the other side so you can reduce the likelihood of miscalculation. Right? You get information about what their positions are, why they're doing certain things, because there's still a lot of issues there. So then just on the Indo-Pacific, my understanding is that this is a response to the rise of China. I don't think that's the official position, but I think it's pretty obvious. Can it be successful? So it's been administration after administration, I think, that looks primarily to India as this silver bullet to resolve the problems with China. And I get so much flack for this at home because my husband's an Indian defense expert. But man, if you think that you're going to build up that Indian military to even be able to balance China remotely, you have more work to do than building up Japan after World War II. I mean, the amount of money and effort that has to go into that. And that's only if the Indians allow it, because then they have. I mean, when I lived in India, the bureaucratic issues are just so immense. So if that's the way the United States is going, of oh well, we can't with all the power and the greatest power, we can't resolve this China issue. Let's hope that India can. I think this administration will find, like previous administrations, it's not going to turn out very well.
Doug, do you have any additional thoughts?
On all three, on the military training issue, in 2015, Xi Jinping announced a significant restructuring of the Chinese military, comparable but probably much more extensive than the Goldwater-Nichols rebuilding of the U.S. military after the Vietnam War, and likely to take as much as the 20 years that Goldwater-Nichols took to get involved. Right now is a great time to interact with Chinese younger officers. They've been promoted. They're better educated than the ones in the earlier generation, but they're really not cosmopolitan. It's a missing element. My interactions with them in the last 2 years have been eye-opening really, now you don't go in with expectations, to go back to where I started, to change China. But knowing the other side and knowing what you're up against, I think can change your perspectives considerably. And I'll come to that in a minute when we talk about Taiwan. On the free and open Indo-Pacific, I've been told now that they're supposed to drop the free and open. They decided that was too hard to maintain as a policy. This is a feeble attempt to try to find a strategy to fit the national security strategy and national defense strategy report requirements. Now, I don't want to build up national security strategies and national defense strategies as the be-all and all. They're congressionally required. The best way to look at those reports is through the rearview mirror right after they come out, because no one will go back to them and look at them again, except foreign reporters and scholars. They really have very little relevance to anything the governments actually do. Now, on Taiwan, to go back to my point about the military, and Xi Jinping's new activism. In the 5 years he's been in, it started a little before him, but he has really grabbed onto China going out, not being inward, not hiding and biding, as the phrase had under Deng Xiaoping's leadership. So China's more active across the board. He's had a stillborn start in 2013. I think he's tried again in the post-19th Party Congress period to launch a more activist Chinese diplomacy with its neighbors. It might look like smile diplomacy in most cases, but not always. We've just seen in the last month a reorganization of the foreign policy bureaucracy in China to try to make it more coherent and to put each ambassador in a greater role of leadership in the country of concern to the Chinese diplomatic establishment. Together with this new military capability, we've got all these younger officers now put in charge of newly shaped regional security belts around China with more resources and more equipment than they've ever had before. And if you're sitting in Korea and you see them coming across your air defense identification zone, you think China's putting pressure on Korea. Or they go into the Senkaku Islands or past Okinawa and they say they're putting pressure on Japan. Or in Taiwan's case, they see H-6 bombers circumnavigating around China and submarines over and over again. They say, oh, they're putting more pressure on Taiwan. For me, they're putting pressure on everybody because they're changing internally dramatically. And it's going to have this all-azimuth effect on their neighbors, and that should be viewed in that way. Now, part of that, what you refer to, are the 31 measures that have been announced by the Taiwan Affairs Office to make working on the mainland and investing on the mainland more attractive to Taiwanese. This is a fairly consistent thing going back a dozen years to the efforts by the PRC to remedy their wholeheartedly unproductive lecturing of Taiwanese people to try to win them over, which led to higher and higher votes for opponents of reunification with China. They tried to turn that around by developing constituencies on the island, doctors, professors, students, young kids who need jobs, and try to create those constituencies. And I think this 31 new measures is very consistent with that effort to try to induce people on Taiwan to separate their personal relationship with the mainland from this Taiwan identity about separation from the mainland, and to see if they can erode that. It's going to take years to see what kind of results they're going to have. And Taiwan has, in the last couple of days, promised to issue a strategy for how they're going to deal with it, but we haven't seen that yet.
Okay. So Elizabeth, did you have anything? Okay. Okay. Next questions? Yes, the man back in there.
Okay. Thanks, Vincent from Harvard Kennedy School. I'm a visiting fellow there. So behind these debates, I find there's a paradoxical logic. That is, when US wants China actually to provide more public goods on the one hand, but on the other hand, when China put forward some initiatives, including the Belt and Road Initiative, Americans view China as a threat and undermining U.S. Established international order. So how should both sides to find a balance between these two conflicting ideas? Thank you.
Great question. Again, over here, another question.
It's Lu Zhenhua from South China Morning Post of Hong Kong. I have a question about Gary Cohen's resignation. I wonder if he's leaving the White House is bad news for China, as China could lose a strong voice in the White House as opposing it to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum. And what would the White House trade policy going in the future as an imminent U.S. trade war with the world regarded as imminent? Okay. Thanks.
So last question. We're running out of time. Any more? Okay, back there. Yeah. The glasses. Yeah. Good.
Corey Bisbee, Sixth Republic, Korea Weekly Brief. I wanted to ask, as was mentioned in the previous panel, China seems to see discursive power as an important arena for competition. To what extent should the United States also be giving attention to that, or putting resources towards such things as what was the USIA and then, of course, Voice of America? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so should we start? Do you want to start this off, Elizabeth?
Sure, I can answer. I think some of these have. So on the question about this call for China to be a more global provider of public goods versus the sort of, once China feels it steps out onto that stage, we view it as a threat. I think the challenge with sort of framing the question that way is that it's too binary, it's too black and white. And I think that you can have at the same time both a desire for China to play a bigger role in the delivery of global public goods, and you can also try to understand how China's behavior on the world stage may or may not be a threat to the United States, right? And I don't think they're a binary. I think they can both be happening at the same time. So we can see China's engagement in the United Nations and providing peacekeeping forces as a deliverer of public goods that I don't think is, well, maybe I'm wrong. You can let me know if we see that as a threat or not. So I just think that that's not the correct way to sort of think about the question. I think you can have both things happening at the same time. And I personally think that finding ways to engage with China to help construct some global governance norms that both the United States and China can agree to as kind of the rules of engagement I think that's a really important opportunity that we have right now. Because China's not going to diminish on the world stage, it's only going to grow. And if we can't find a way to together figure out what those global governance norms are going to be, then our competition doesn't have a framework in which we kind of all agree to the rules of engagement. And I think that's the interesting moment that we're in right now, is that we're evolving towards that, and we don't know what that's going to look like. And it's important, I think, for the United States to have a strong view from our own point of view and our own interests, what that global norm should look like, and then try to build that together with China. And I think that sort of gets to this question of discourse war or discursive power, where I do think the United States, we've been able to exist in the world, and that's our discourse, right? A lot of it. I mean, yes, we have USAID and we have Radio Free Asia, et cetera, but really it's been the power of our values and our ideals and our governance system that has spoken for itself. And now I think we need to re-embrace those values and become a leader for those values on the world stage. And whether that means, I don't know that means we need institutions for, delivering that message, but rather through our own behavior and our own engagement in the world and our own adherence to our own values. I would, maybe that's idealistic, but would hope that would be a significant way to engage in a discourse war or competition with China.
That's great. So we're actually out of time, but do you guys have very last comments, like a minute or less, each of you first, Oriana?
Sure, I'll just very quickly respond to the question about the public goods. I can understand China's confusion, but the difference is what you mean by public goods. My understanding is that China is actually not providing public goods with the OBOR. It's part of the striving for achievement strategy, which is leveraging your economic power to gain, more influence in other areas. So you look at their military presence, it's the same type of thing. They don't engage in a lot of like medical missions. Even when they did the Gulf of Aden deployment, they refused to engage in the 3 other task forces directly with other countries. It was about exercising their own capabilities and the benefits to China. So I think what the United States wants is for China to engage in some activities that are beneficial for other countries, equally, if not more so than they are for China. And that, at least from the U.S. perspective, which is probably different from the Chinese perspective, is what makes a global leader.
Well, I'd strike a note of difference with Oriana on the Chinese activities in the Gulf of Aden. They have been all but members of the coalition in dealing with the Task Force 150. They formally keep separate, and yet we've watched them deploy squadron after squadron and see the officers in command of those squadrons rapidly appointed to much higher positions. It's been an opportunity for them to get out and get internationalized, and we should be engaging with them more to try to influence the people who are moving up rapidly in the Chinese Navy. China didn't have a Navy since about 1400, so it's kind of a critical moment when you can involve yourself. And on Mr. Liu's question about Gary Cohn, I think the loss of the thoughts and influence of Gary Cohn is a loss for the United States, principally. China may also suffer.
Okay, well, thank you all. I hope you've obtained some fresh perspectives and some new insights from this, and that you will all continue in that goal of thinking about the dispassionately, what are our interests, how can we best meet the challenges, but also take advantage of the opportunities to cooperate with China going forward. And thank you again very much. I'm sure we'll see you again at a future program here at Brookings. Thank you.